Hey drivers, Sunil here, and this is your weekly broker tip for Friday, June 2nd, 2023. So once again, I'm not an attorney and this is not legal advice. Don't take it as legal advice. So this week's broker tip is around property tax prorations that are done at closing. If the buyer and seller are using either Form 310 or Form 330, unless there's an extra addendum or any language that's been added to the contract, Paragraph 22 of Form 310 and in Form 330, I believe it's paragraph 28, the adjustments paragraph, talks about how the tax prorations are going to be made, or rather what information are the tax prorations going to be based off of. So this line right here in Form 310, and it's the same language in Form 330, it says, let me get rid of that. It says, closing attorney shall make tax proration based on the available tax info deemed reliable by the closing attorney. So ultimately, if there's a dispute, it's up to the closing attorney on what information they want to use, what they deem to be reliable. It does say if the tax or tax estimate or proration later changes, both parties, or if it becomes inaccurate, both parties agree to make financial adjustments between themselves once they get accurate info. And it also assumes that the buyer has to take timely, reasonable steps to minimize the taxes. The number one step the buyer has to do is submit their documentation or proof that they are going to use the home as their primary residence, if that is indeed the case. Sometimes you have a seller who's been using a property as an investment property, and so they're paying taxes based on 6%. The buyer is going to be using it as a primary residence, so they'll most likely get the 4%. And so the seller says, well, I don't want to give a proration on the 6% because in some cases that can be thousands of dollars more than they would have to give. I recently had a situation where the seller was a disabled veteran, so he didn't pay any property taxes at all, but my buyer wanted to get a credit. They still wanted to get a credit from the seller just in case the county was going to charge them for the entire year. So there was a little bit of dispute. We went back and forth, but ultimately, the attorney made the call, and thankfully it wasn't a huge amount. It was just a few $100s, so we were able to work it out. But just keep that in mind. And the other thing I will say is, even though the language in the contract says that the buyer and seller have to make financial adjustments between themselves later on if they get more accurate information, I think we all know for practical purposes, trying to get money out of a seller or a buyer after closing is going to be really difficult. And I have seen some attorneys who will have both parties sign something at closing that says that the proration is final. So of course, if that happens, typically I would imagine that that's going to override the language that's in the contract. But once again, if your buyer has or your seller has a question about how tax prorations are going to be handled, it's best for them to check with the closing attorney. Hopefully that's helpful. Reach out if you have any questions. If not, enjoy the rest of your day and have a fantastic weekend.